It was late afternoon when Emily and Chris set off on a quiet drive along the countryside. The golden rays of the sun stretched across the road, yet the atmosphere inside the car was heavy. Chris, gripping the steering wheel tightly, had barely said a word. Emily glanced at him, trying to read his expression, but his jaw was clenched, his thoughts far away. "Do you want to talk about it?" Emily asked softly, breaking the silence. "No," Chris replied, curtly. "Not now." The hum of the engine filled the void. Emily sighed and looked out the window, watching the trees blur past. She didn't want to push him, but the weight of unspoken tension pressed down on both of them. Soon, they pulled over at a small roadside store. Chris stayed in the car, still brooding, while Emily decided to stretch her legs and grab some water. Inside, the shopkeeper gave her a curious glance. "You traveling alone?" he asked casually as she paid. "No, my boyfriend is in the car," she replied, forcing a polite smile. The shopkeeper's gaze lingered for a moment longer than she liked. She felt uneasy but brushed it off, grabbing the bottle and heading back to the car. Chris was still staring straight ahead when she returned. She handed him the water, but he didn't even look at her. "Let's just go," he muttered. The tension was suffocating. Desperate to lighten the mood, Emily spotted a weathered sign on the roadside. "Mangrove Walking Trail, 3 km. "Let's take a break," she suggested. "Get some fresh air. It might help." Chris hesitated but eventually nodded, pulling the car into a gravel lot near the trailhead. Leaving their phones behind, they stepped onto the narrow path. At first, the forest seemed serene. The dense canopy overhead filtered the sunlight into soft, golden beams. Birds chirped faintly in the distance, and the air smelled of damp earth and moss. But as they walked deeper, the quiet grew almost oppressive. Emily noticed a small sign half hidden in the bushes. The paint was faded, but the message was clear: "Stay on the path." She frowned, the words sending an inexplicable chill down her spine. They continued walking until they found a bench surrounded by tall trees. The forest seemed endless, stretching into the horizon like a green ocean. Emily sat down and looked at Chris, her voice gentle. "I brought you here because I thought it might help you relax," she said. Chris let out a bitter laugh. "Relax? Do you really think walking in some creepy forest is going to fix everything? You don't get it, Emily." Before she could respond, he stood up abruptly and stormed off. Emily watched him disappear down the trail, frustration and sadness welling up inside her. She stayed on the bench for a moment, trying to gather her thoughts. That's when she heard a faint rustling sound, almost like footsteps, coming from the trees. "Chris," she called out, her voice tinged with unease. There was no reply. She stood, scanning the forest. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift, but it could have just been her imagination. "Chris," she called again, louder this time. Still nothing. Her heart began to race as she started down the path in the direction Chris had gone. The rustling grew louder, and she quickened her pace. She caught a glimpse of movement, a dark figure darting between the trees. "Chris, stop messing around," she yelled, her voice shaky. Suddenly, she felt something grab her. Branches, thick and twisted, seemed to come alive, wrapping around her arms and legs. She struggled, panic surging through her as the sharp edges scratched her skin. Finally, with a desperate tug, she broke free. Blood trickled down her arm from a deep gash. Bandaging it with her scarf, she pushed forward. Her breaths came in short gasps as the forest seemed to close in around her. She called out for Chris again and finally saw him standing on the path ahead. Relief flooded her. "Chris," she cried, running toward him. "We have to leave," he said, his voice urgent. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously around the forest. They started running back toward the car, but the path seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning in ways it hadn't before. The trees loomed larger, their branches clawing at them like skeletal hands. Then, Chris was gone. Emily stopped, spinning around frantically. "Chris," she screamed, but the only response was the eerie silence of the forest. Her chest tightened as she spotted a figure standing in the shadows. It wasn't Chris. It was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce her soul. Before she could react, it vanished. Her eyes darted around wildly, and that's when she noticed Chris's jacket caught on a bush, far off the path. A sign nearby warned again, "Stay on the path." But she couldn't leave him. Ignoring the warning, she stepped into the dense underbrush. The forest grew darker, colder. The trees seemed alive, their twisted trunks and gnarled branches forming grotesque shapes. Shadows moved just beyond her vision, and the air was thick with an unnatural chill. After what felt like hours, she stumbled upon an old, dilapidated house hidden deep in the forest. Its windows were shattered, and its walls were covered in creeping vines. Against her better judgment, she stepped inside. The house was eerily silent. The ground floor was empty, but something compelled her to climb the rickety stairs. Each step creaked loudly, echoing through the stillness. At the top, she froze. The dark figure was there, standing at the base of the stairs, its hollow eyes locked on hers. She bolted into a nearby room and slammed the door shut, her hands trembling as she locked it. The room was a chaotic mess, overturned furniture and shattered glass scattered everywhere. Then came a knock at the door, and Chris's voice. "Emily, it's me. Open the door." Her hand hovered over the lock, but something felt off. The voice was too calm, too deliberate. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. Hours seemed to pass as she sat in the corner, her mind racing. Suddenly, she saw the figure outside the window, staring at her with its hollow eyes. Terror took over, and she ran. She sprinted blindly into the forest, her lungs burning and her vision blurred with tears. She didn't stop until she saw the figure again, standing still. This time, it pointed to something on the ground. A body. It was Chris. His lifeless eyes stared up at the canopy, his face frozen in a look of terror. "No!" Emily screamed, collapsing beside him. The figure stepped closer, its icy hand reaching out. Pain shot through Emily's arm as darkness consumed her. When Emily woke, she was in a stark, white room. She was strapped to a bed, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling her nostrils. "She's awake," a voice said. Emily turned her head and saw a doctor speaking to a nurse. "She's been here ever since the incident," the doctor explained. "The mangrove forest is cursed. It's said to be haunted by witches, and so many have gone missing there. She's one of the few who made it out, but the trauma, it's left her mentally fractured. She keeps reliving that night in her dreams." Emily stared blankly at the ceiling, her mind trapped in the endless nightmare of the mangrove forest. Some paths, she thought, should never be taken.